Hello there, and welcome back to War Thunder, to the tank review on the T-90A. Before we go into the statistical comparison, and you can enjoy also some gameplay in the background, I just want to say a few words about this tank. I love my Soviet MBTs when it comes to their style, their flair, their looks. And while they never were as good, at least when you just looked at a certain number of statistics compared to their NATO counterparts, they still were useful. They still could get the job done, and in one way or another they were just different and in some aspects a bit more versatile, and then paid for that in other aspects that are maybe a bit better useful in the meta. The T-90A, as it is right now in War Thunder, though, made my head scratch quite a bit, and this is why I then will also statistically compare it to the T-80U, which shares the top battle rating of 10.7 with it. And I think that the T-90A is one of those tanks that you could then classify, if you would really go for it, as an exaggeration, as a bit of a glass cannon. But it fails then in the cannon part in certain aspects. We will see what that actually means. As it stands right now, there is little point in getting this tank. Maybe we'll see more modern versions in the future of this tank that then try to iron out some of the disadvantages that this tank has in its own tech tree. So without further ado, let's start with the review, shall we? As usual, I want to begin with the armor, and well, the steel armor tells us only one thing, that the lower plate is 85mm with an additional 20mm on top of it, and the rest is also here on the side plating only 80mm with a very thin 10mm actually, and 20mm at the bottom behind the drive wheels. The rear is 40mm, and the engine deck is somewhere between 20 and 5mm, with the turret roof being 45mm, to which we will come in just a moment. However, there are certain other aspects that get visible only with the X-ray. For example, the composite armor, and when it comes to the side of the hull and the lower glazes, the lack of such. So the upper frontal glazes is worth discussing, because in the current meta there are two rounds that are highly dangerous to you. The good old CL3143 that you'll find on 3 of the top tier Italian vehicles and one of the Swedish light tanks / tank destroyers, and also the new DM53 that you can find on the Leopard 2A6. However, there is a big gap on the lower glazes where you only have to go through steel, so practically every tank with APFSDs might go through this. And there is the driver's hatch, which doesn't look really much like a big gap, but only if we then go into this view, you can then see how much is actually cut out in front of the driver's head. That is a big gap. And then there is obviously the turret ring and the gun breech area. And this gun breech area is also bigger than on the T-80U. The turret, for all intents and purposes, is immune and impervious to all of the APFSDs in the game and all the ATGMs as far as I can tell. However, then we also have a bit of Contact 5 integrated era, which makes this tank really strong versus Heat FS and ATGMs, as long as those ATGMs are not tandem warheads, and we also have a good portion of them on the side. However, that doesn't really help you if you get shot if you're even slightly angled. And then the composite armor also protects like half of the turret, which is a bit unfortunate because the 2 crew members are just behind that. If we then go behind the armor, we can see a lot of ammunition, and overall we have 43 rounds. The first ammo rack is, or the first stage ammo stowage as it is officially called, is 22 rounds with 1 in the breech. That's an overall ammunition capacity of 23 without giving additional room like here in the fuel tanks or just behind the side plating. That might help you in a few cases, but honestly, this ammunition carousel occupies such a large portion of the volume of the tank from literally all sides. It is almost impossible to pen the tank and not do either fatal crew or fatal ammo stowage or catastrophic damage in general. So that is not great. Also, you only have 3 instead of 4 or 5 crew members like on the Western/NATO main battle tanks. So armor protection, debatable. The turret is strong though. One more thing is, I have not really noticed this with a lot of the other Soviet tanks, but in this tank, this rooftop here, 45 millimeters, that got penned quite often by either ATGMs, HEAT-FS, and APFSDS, and either crippled the tank in terms of blackening the gun breech, or outright killing the 2 turret crew members, therefore rendering the tank being destroyed. So, armor protection, debatable. Survivability, some of the worst in game. Now let's have a look at some other stuff surrounding this tank's performance, at least number wise. So let's start the comparison with the mobility, and I also included here the T-80U, which then tells a story by itself. First of all, the T-90A has here with 1000 horsepower the weakest engine by quite a bit, but it is one of the lightest tanks, giving it a horsepower to ton ratio of 21.5. That is just marginally better than the Challenger 22F and a whopping 26% less than the T-80U, which is in this comparison the highest, whereas we have not included here the Type 90. The top speed also tells you a story. The T-90A is the second slowest with 60 km per hour, and the T-80U with 70, the second fastest. And then there is the tragedy, that is the reverse speed. And it has to be said, that is awful, terrible, disgusting, unusable and unforgiving to have minus 4 km per hour as a reverse speed at top tier. That is really letting you little space for repositioning, which is also amplified by having no neutral steering. Now, while the T-80U is here 3 times faster, it's also not the very best when you compare it to the Western MBTs that also can work ridgelines significantly better, to which we'll come in just a moment. But I think one of the more comical comparisons is here between the M1A2 Abrams and the T-90A with the reverse speed. It's a complete magnitude in difference. 4 kilometers versus 40 kilometers per hour in reverse. That is just making the difference really clear. Now, there is one thing that I have to add here with the mobility that kind of closes the gap in performance to the Western MBTs from the T-90A's perspective, which is true actually for all the Soviet MBTs, and that is there is a weird lack of friction. And so when you drive this tank, you notice, especially when you go around the corner, you just don't turn around the corner, you slide around the corner. You feel like driving on ice, in contrast to the Western MBTs, which feel like they have to go through molasses in contrast. So this is one of those things that is great for enhancing the mobility artificially. I have no idea where this is coming from. Maybe the 15 to 20 tons less of weight for the Soviet MBTs reduces here the grip so much. But on the other hand, it makes you uncontrollable. If you have to stop, you just keep turning, you just keep sliding and drifting, and then you expose a bit of your weak side armor, and poof, your ammo rack goes. And you see the Soviet emergency turret ejection system also in Russian service in good condition. So, therefore, you have to go as far as to go to the light tanks and go into the options and enable the driver assistance mode, or the cruise control as it is called. And that then helps you to stop the drifting, to stop the turning if you are doing it unwanted. I have set it to the control key, which is kind of appropriate. Now finally, let's talk about the business end of the T-90A, which has the joint biggest caliber, and that is the 2A46M5. That carries 43 rounds of ammunition. As I discussed previously, 23 should be the max that you take with you. And then we have the longest reload of 7.1 seconds. And the T-80U then also has 6.5 seconds, which is a whopping 8.5% faster. So even there, the T-90A is the worst. But for both the T-90A and the T-80U, this is an auto-loading system, meaning it is independent from the crew skills. So all the Western MBTs that have more than 15% faster reload, up to close to 30% faster reload, they have to work with their crew skills. So you need the expert qualification, the ace qualification, a completely well-trained and maxed out crew to achieve this. And especially if you lose crew, if you don't have the best crew and you don't have the civil lines for the expert qualification, their reload gets longer and longer and longer. Whereas with the T-90A and the T-80U, even if you lose crew and you're down to only 2, then you still have the full autoloader capacity. So in the beginning of the match, it's very likely that you lose a head standoff, etc. And that is just not that great when you get outgunned and out-reloaded. But the longer the battle goes, the more likely it is that you take damage, if you survive it, and the enemy takes damage. And if you clash with 2 damaged tanks, then you are, in theory, in a better condition. However, let's talk about the rest of the gun handling. The turret rotation speed with 24 degrees per second is just miles off from what the Western MBTs managed to do, and that is 66% faster when it comes to the NATO tanks. So you're not really feeling that great. It feels more like World War II style. Then we also have the gun depression. It's -4 degrees. That is terrible. Even if you think that you can easily be on level ground, you very often find yourself that you just miss a little bit the gun depression. And especially in a brawl, you can very often not depress into the hull of an MBT that's just face-hugging you. The T-80U is better by 1 degree, and that is just significantly better. And then we also have only 14 degrees of gun elevation. This is further made worse by only 3.5 degrees of vertical speed or elevation speed of the gun. That is less than World War II level. And 4.4 degrees for the T-80U is also significantly worse than all the other Western MBTs. But it's still like a third better than the T-90A. At least you have thermal imaging, but only for the gunner. This is true for both the T-90A and the T-80U. Now, one thing that has to be mentioned here is the insane zoom that the T-90A has, which then just is, for me as somebody that plays through all the nations, I'm not very used to it, and so I miss a lot of shots, and then I have to range find more often rather than being, with the muscle memory able to mark one eyeball the shots more or less accurately. So far, mobility, debatable. Gun handling, terrible. Armor protection and survivability, debatable at best. Let's have a look at the ammunition to see if we can bring a little bit of salvation there. And we begin with the stock HeatFS, the 3BK18M. It has better penetration than the Western 120mm ones, but you have a slower muzzle velocity with only 905 meters per second. HeatFS has many drawbacks. It prematurely detonates on walls, bushes, trees, fences, and also doesn't really do very well versus composite armor to begin with, and then outright terrible versus era protection. So the stock grind with this round is difficult at best at this meta. The second stock shell is the 3OF26 EDKV, which is a high explosive time fuse one, and you can set the distance with the laser range finder. As you can see in the background, I tried this versus helicopters with debatable success. So the explosion looks phenomenal. The bursting charge of 5.24 kilograms of TNT equivalent produces 42 millimeters of penetration. That sounds great. Versus aircraft, that's bad. The muzzle velocity with only 850 meters per second is also not that great, and quite a few helicopters can see literally the shell coming and do some dodging. Also, and this, I know this sounds weird, but also I think that the automatic is significantly better useful with only a single 3-inch shell, for the single reason that it has a proximity fuse, so it explodes at the best distance regardless of what you would set the distance to. And also, I don't know what it is, but very often it looked like the shell explodes right next to the helicopter and does no damage whatsoever. In practice, this has very limited use versus helicopter. If it works, it would be glorious, but mostly it's very hard to make work. And also you have to go through a 7.1 second reload to reload it, and you have very limited ammunition capacity if you begin to mix your ammunition, which I think is one of those aspects of this tank that I would advise against. Then when you do then side shots and you have only the thin armor of the Western MBTs available, if you have a shot trap, or you can just bring the ammunition detonate on the roof of an enemy MBT, that's great. In theory, you also can hull break enemies that are behind cover. You laser range find the rock that they're behind in, drive a bit forwards, and then just, blab them behind cover. In practice, that is not useful. In theory, a diverse shell. In practice, not practical. The third shell type is finally an APFSDS round. As a tier 1 modification, the 3BM22 has a fantastic muzzle velocity of 1760 meters per second, with a penetration of 425 millimeters against flat armor and 193 millimeters against 60 degrees angles of attack. However, as you can see, this is less than half the penetration at 60 degrees that we have at 0 degrees. That means we have no positive normalization, and that is kind of a massive drawback at top tier. So the APFSDS is still very much capable of punching through an enemy tank and doing all the spalling. It's very easy to lead the shell. It goes through bushes, fences, trees, and to a certain degree also through houses, which you can forget with the chemical energy based weaponry. And so you still can get the side shots, you can still aim at the drive front wheel of an enemy tank and punch through the entirety of the tank, but versus the majority of tanks, you can't even contest the turret armor and or the upper frontal glacis. Lower glacis shots, turret ring shots, and gun breach shots, or gunshots therefore, are then finally reliably possible with this round. The fourth shell type is the 9M119M1 ATGM with a tandem charge. It has a maximum speed of 350 meters per second, a firing range of up to 5 kilometers, and with 850 millimeters of penetration, it is actually usable. Because in conjunction with the tandem charge, you can punch through a lot of the hull armor of Western MBTs and also snipe some helicopters. But there are quite a few problems with it. First of all, the launch is awfully slow at the moment, and that has cost me dearly in one of the gameplays. You can actually see this, and I would really be careful taking some of them with you. In anti-helicopter work, it might actually be more useful than the dedicated high explosive time fuse shell. But anyway, it is up to you if you want to research it or not as a tier 3 modification. And finally, we come to the fifth and final shell type, which is the 3BM42M APFSDS. As far as I can tell, that is the best Soviet APFSDS in the game at this moment. With 1700 meters per second muzzle velocity, it is a bit slower than the predecessor as a tier 1 modification, but has 526 millimeters of penetration, and at 60 degrees angles of attack, a respectable 304 millimeters. That is also a positive normalization. However, if we compare this with the Western MBTs, we can see that this is just not really something worth talking about. And all nations so far, except the Swedish, do better than this. However, it is significantly more capable than the T-80U. With this shell, you can punch through the upper plate on the Leopard 2A5 and Leopard 2A6, and he can do this to you likewise with the DM53. Lol pen for everybody, everybody's happy, right? So that is the state of top tier, and with that we have come to an end with the statistical comparison. So now time to give this tank a verdict. Is it worth going for it? What should I do if I already have the T-80U? Should I still research the T-90 and then think to myself that this tank is better? To be honest, if we only go by the Soviet tech tree, I think it's a little bit of a downgrade from the T-72B3 actually, and as we saw, in almost every aspect that really matters, the T-80U is better. It's faster, forwards, in reverse, it has better gun handling and also better reload. And I'm not quite sure if the top ATGM and the top APFSDS really make up for it. To be honest, in the majority of situations, not really. So this feels a bit like a downgrade, and I hope for a better version in the future. As far as I'm concerned, this tank is not worth the 400,000 RP research and then the stock run. However, I personally like the tank for its style, but at this point I've played such tanks in the dozens, quite literally. And to be honest, if you like this tank or not is entirely up to you. I've given you the facts and my opinion. And now let me know in the comment section what you think about this tank. How does it look in the comparison, especially with the Soviet MBTs? And do you feel that this is kind of represented in the game as well? Or are the statistics only statistics that then don't matter for good players? Let me know. That's it for me today. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a like, give it a subscribe if you want to see more. And we'll see each other on the waves, in the skies, and on the battlefields of War Thunder.